I left the funeral with the scent of lilies on my black coat, carrying a life-altering secret. I went to my mother and brother to share my husband's legacy, but they never saw a grieving widow. They only saw 6 Manhattan lofts and $8.5 million. They assumed I came for support, completely unaware I was just waiting to see who would drop their mask first. Once their greed spoke, my family began digging their own graves. I am Sophia Murray, 34 years old, and I am standing entirely alone at the edge of a freshly filled grave. The heavy mahogany casket holding my husband, Evan Rowe, had been lowered into the frozen, unforgiving earth exactly 45 minutes ago. The scattering of polite, somber acquaintances had murmured their hushed condolences and retreated to their warm, idling cars, leaving me to the biting, relentless wind of the New York afternoon. The tears had stopped falling somewhere between the final church service and the wrought iron cemetery gates. In their place, a profound, glacial numbness had settled over my entire being. It was not a paralyzing shock, but rather a hyper-aware, crystalline sobriety that made every color around me seem too stark, every sound too loud. Every detail of the sprawling, silent graveyard seemed etched in high definition: the withered brown edges of the expensive floral wreaths, the sharp, metallic scent of overturned soil, the gray, oppressive sky pressing down heavily on the marble headstones. I stood there, waiting like a statue wrapped in black wool. I was waiting for my mother, Lorraine Murray, and my older brother, Declan Murray. They had sworn, with all the theatrical, gripping earnestness my family was famous for, that they would be by my side before the first prayer was even spoken. They were supposed to be the ones holding my arms, anchoring me to the ground, shielding me from the pitying stares of Evan's business associates. Yet, the manicured, winding paths behind me remained entirely empty. No sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. No hurried footsteps crunched on the loose gravel. The absence was absolute, echoing louder than any spoken words. The biting cold finally urged me to pull my phone from the deep pocket of my coat. The screen lit up, blindingly bright against the gray afternoon, displaying a sudden cascade of unread messages. But they were not frantic apologies from Lorraine or Declan claiming they were stuck in traffic. They were texts from Evan's closest friends and former colleagues. I opened the first message from David, Evan's oldest college roommate. He wrote that he was profoundly sorry he missed the burial, explaining that he only just saw the email saying the ceremony time had been pushed back by 3 hours. I frowned, my thumb hovering uncertainly over the glass. I quickly opened another message from Sarah, a senior partner at Evan's old firm. She sent a nearly identical text, apologizing profusely for her absence and mentioning the sudden, strange schedule change notification she received early that morning. A cold that had absolutely nothing to do with the winter air seeped deep into my veins, freezing my blood. There had been no schedule change. I had meticulously planned every second of this day. Someone had deliberately misinformed Evan's people. The isolation of my mourning was not a tragedy of circumstance or a cruel twist of fate. It was an orchestrated quarantine. The realization clicked into place with sickening finality. My family's absence was not a delay. It was a calculated strategy to leave me unmoored and vulnerable. The crunch of heavy footsteps finally broke the graveyard silence. I turned, half expecting to see my brother's faux apologetic face rushing toward me, but it was Julian, a junior legal assistant who had worked very closely with Evan. He looked completely out of breath, his dark tie slightly askew, completely bypassing the solemn, quiet etiquette of a graveside visit. He stopped a few feet away, his expression tight with an intense urgency. He bypassed the standard condolences entirely. He told me, his voice lowered, that Mara Bell, Evan's private attorney, needed to see me immediately at her office. It was not phrased as a request. He mentioned an urgent, highly confidential estate file that could not possibly wait until tomorrow morning. 30 minutes later, the heavy soundproof glass doors of Bell Vantage Council closed firmly behind me, completely shutting out the chaotic city noise. The law firm's interior was a modern fortress of polished walnut, brushed steel, and hushed, intimidating competence. Mara Bell, a formidable woman whose sharp, assessing eyes missed absolutely nothing, bypassed the soft, sympathetic pleasantries. She guided me efficiently into her expansive corner office, motioning for me to sit in a heavy, structured leather chair that made me feel small. She did not offer me water or tissues. She offered me a thick, ivory envelope. The dark red wax seal on the back was completely unbroken. Across the front, written in the unmistakable, assertive, heavy slant of Evan's handwriting, were a few words. I traced the black ink with my leather-gloved finger for a long moment before breaking the seal. The handwritten note inside was brief, bearing a chilling warning that made the breath catch sharply in my throat. Evan had written that I must not tell anyone everything before I see exactly how they react. Mara folded her perfectly manicured hands on the pristine, clutter-free desk and began to outline the staggering reality of my new life. Evan had always been a man of deeply calculated moves, always planning 5 steps ahead, and his death was clearly no exception. She spoke in clear, measured, clinical tones, detailing an estate that made the large office feel suddenly suffocating. He had left me absolute, uncontested ownership of his entire fortune. The liquid assets in his various investment accounts alone totaled exactly $8.5 million, but that immense sum was merely the foundation. I was now the sole, outright owner of 6 luxury lofts scattered across the most desirable high-rent neighborhoods in Manhattan. Furthermore, I held total, uncontested controlling interest in his highly lucrative private firm, Rose Stratton Risk Advisory. I sat frozen in the leather chair, the weight of the crisp paper in my hands feeling heavier than the mahogany casket I had just watched disappear into the ground. My husband had not just left me generational wealth, he had left me a suit of armor. He knew the wolves were circling the perimeter before I even heard their hungry howls. He knew my blood relatives better than I wanted to admit. Mara paused, looking at me with a quiet respect, and asked if I wanted a private car to take me back to our dark, empty apartment to rest. I stood up slowly, smoothing the sharp wrinkles from my black wool skirt. I declined her offer with a shake of my head. I told her I was going straight to Brooklyn Heights. The taxi ride across the long bridge was a rapid blur of gray river water and thick steel cables. I stared blankly out the smudged window, my mind racing through cold, tactical, survival calculations. I was heading straight into the belly of the beast, to my mother's elegant townhouse. I needed to look directly into her eyes and Declan's eyes when I dropped the bait. I would not tell them the whole truth tonight. I would give them just the gleaming surface, just enough to measure the true depth of their greed. I would tell them about the staggering amount of money and the highly valuable physical properties, but I would keep the ironclad legal protections, the corporate control, and Evan's final warning entirely in the dark. Evan had meticulously built an impenetrable fortress around me in secret. Now, it was my turn to draw the map, invite my treacherous family inside, and wait in the shadows to see who would try to burn it down first. The heavy brass knocker of the Brooklyn Heights townhouse felt like solid ice pressing through my black leather gloves. I stood on the pristine sandstone steps, the chilling wind whipping off the East River and tearing at the hem of my dark coat. The massive mahogany door swung inward before I even had the chance to release the knocker. Lorraine stood framed in the warm, golden light of the foyer, draped in a tasteful charcoal cashmere cardigan that whispered of subdued, elegant mourning. Her eyes, dry and sharp as freshly shattered glass, scanned my face for a fraction of a second before her performance truly began. She pulled me into a slow, perfectly calibrated embrace. It was the exact type of hug you see in prestige television dramas, lingering just long enough to suggest deep maternal comfort. But her hands patted my upper back with a hollow, rhythmic, and calculating distance. She smelled heavily of expensive bergamot perfume and unspoken lies. I stepped over the threshold, my boots sinking silently into the antique Persian rug. The house was stiflingly warm, thick with the scent of roasted meats and old money. Declan was already waiting in the formal living room, swirling a generous pour of amber bourbon in a heavy crystal tumbler. He wore a crisp navy button-down shirt with the cuffs rolled up, looking significantly less like a man who had just missed his brother-in-law's funeral and much more like a junior partner gearing up for a hostile corporate takeover. He set his glass down on the marble coaster with a soft thud and expertly arranged his features into a mask of profound, tragic shock. He crossed the expansive room, offering a brief, muscular squeeze of my shoulder that felt entirely devoid of actual warmth. "Sophia," Declan murmured, his voice adopting a practiced, husky timbre meant to convey deep sorrow. "I cannot even begin to tell you how incredibly sorry we are. The traffic on the expressway was an absolute nightmare. A massive multi-car pileup involving 2 commercial trucks. We were trapped on the bridge for over 3 hours with nowhere to turn around." I nodded slowly, letting the elaborate lie hang in the heavy, quiet air between us. I did not mention the text messages from David or Sarah. I did not mention the phantom schedule change. I let my physical exhaustion, which was deeply and agonizingly real, dictate my posture. I sank into the plush velvet armchair nearest the unlit marble fireplace, letting my shoulders drop. "It is over," I said quietly, staring at the empty hearth. Declan did not offer me a glass of water or a measure of bourbon. He leaned casually against the polished wooden mantel, crossing his ankles. "Listen, I know this is the absolute worst possible time to bring anything like this up," he started, the pivot in his tone so incredibly swift it almost gave me whiplash. But Evan was a very complicated guy with a massive amount of moving parts in his portfolio. Did he leave everything clearly defined for you? You know exactly how these complicated estate things can get tied up in messy probate courts for years if the paperwork is not completely bulletproof from day one. He had not asked if I had managed to eat anything today. He had not asked how I survived watching the heavy wooden coffin go down into the frozen dirt. He only wanted to know if the vault door was locked or left slightly ajar. I looked down at my hands, studying the pale, cold skin around my platinum wedding band. I took a slow, deep, stabilizing breath, preparing to set the plan in motion. "Yes," I said, my voice remarkably steady and clear. "It is very clear. Mara Bell walked me through the primary assets this afternoon at her office." Lorraine sat perched delicately on the very edge of the matching velvet sofa, her spine rigidly straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. And she prompted, the single syllable sharp enough to draw blood. I looked up, meeting her predatory gaze directly. "Evan left me $8.5 million in liquid capital, and he left me 6 luxury lofts in Manhattan." The silence that immediately followed was not the respectful, heavy hush of sympathy or awe. It was the suffocating, dense vacuum of rapid, violent financial calculation. It was the distinct sound of 2 starving predators realizing a massive, undefended kill had just been dropped directly into their territory. Declan stopped swirling his bourbon completely. Lorraine's breath caught audibly in the back of her throat. The sheer, staggering volume of the wealth hung over the antique lamps and expensive rugs like a physical weight pressing down on the room. Lorraine recovered first, her maternal facade cracking instantly to reveal the cold, pragmatic tactician underneath. 6 lofts, she repeated, her voice dropping a full octave. "Are those deeded directly in your name, Sophia? Or did Evan structure them under a holding company or a limited liability corporation to shield the assets?" I stared at her blankly. It was a wildly specific, highly technical legal question for a grieving mother to ask her freshly widowed daughter less than 3 hours after a burial service. "I am still reviewing the structures," I replied vaguely, letting my voice waver just a fraction to feign confusion. Declan immediately stepped in, completely abandoning his relaxed posture against the mantel. He began pacing the short length of the woven carpet, his eyes wide and practically vibrating with sudden electric energy. "Because if they are directly in your name, the property taxes alone in those zip codes will bleed you entirely dry within 2 years. We need to look at the rental cash flow immediately. Are there current tenants in all 6 units? What are the lease terms? You cannot possibly manage 6 properties across the city while you are grieving." "Sophia," He waved his hand dismissively through the air. We might need to look into your quick sale rights. Honestly, the smartest play right now would be to bundle the assets. Package 3 or 4 of the underperforming units together and offload them to a commercial developer to optimize your tax burden and get you clean cash. He was talking rapidly, his hands cutting sharp angles through the air, already carving up my inheritance like a roasted bird on a silver platter. I sat perfectly still in the velvet chair, letting their words wash over me. Neither of them asked which of the beautiful lofts held the most memories of Evan. Neither of them asked if Evan had set up a safety net for my emotional well-being, or if he had written me a final letter, or how I was supposed to survive sleeping in a cold, empty bed tonight. They only saw the raw, unrefined materials of their own financial salvation. An hour later, Lorraine insisted I stay for dinner, claiming I was far too emotionally fragile to be alone in my own apartment. We sat at the long mahogany dining table under the harsh, glittering glare of a crystal chandelier. The meal was a miserable blur of tasteless roasted chicken and wilted bitter greens. I kept my eyes downcast, playing the part of the broken, overwhelmed, and entirely clueless widow to absolute perfection. Declan sat directly across from me, his smartphone resting flat on the polished wood right beside his dinner plate. The screen illuminated the dim room every few minutes with incoming notifications. He thought I was completely lost in my own despair, staring blankly at the condensation forming on my untouched water glass. But my peripheral vision was sharp, honed by years of managing massive, chaotic data archives. When Lorraine stood up and turned her back to clear the porcelain salad plates, Declan grabbed his phone. His thumbs flew across the glass keyboard with frantic, desperate speed. He tilted the screen slightly away from me to hide his conversation, but the bright reflection caught perfectly in the polished silver blade of the serving knife resting near the floral centerpiece. The letters were slightly distorted by the curve of the metal, but my eyes traced the bright, glowing shapes quickly and accurately. I read the exact words he was sending to an unknown contact. She has all 6. We move fast or we lose the window. I picked up my heavy crystal water glass and took a slow, measured sip, letting the freezing liquid wash down my dry throat. The bone-deep exhaustion I had carried in from the cemetery solidified into something incredibly hard, cold, and immensely powerful. I was no longer sitting in my childhood home sharing a meal with my flesh and blood. The fragile illusion of family had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a sterile, brutally illuminated arena. I was sitting squarely in the middle of a high-stakes negotiation table, completely surrounded by ruthless opportunists who viewed my fresh, bleeding grief not as a devastating tragedy, but as a narrow, highly profitable investment window. And they had absolutely no idea they were sitting across from someone who had already memorized their entire playbook. The dessert plates had barely been cleared when Lorraine launched her final offensive of the evening. She placed a warm, manicured hand over mine, her eyes welling with highly engineered, perfectly timed tears. She insisted I absolutely could not go back to an empty, echoing apartment on the very night I buried my husband. It was unnatural, she claimed, a cruelty no mother could allow. I needed to sleep in my old childhood bedroom, surrounded by family, safe from the crushing isolation of grief. I agreed with a weak, trembling nod. I knew from decades of bitter experience that her sudden bursts of maternal sanctuary always served as the velvet cloth draped over a steel trap. By accepting her invitation, I was willingly stepping into the cage, giving myself the perfect vantage point to study the locking mechanism. The guest room on the second floor was suffocatingly familiar, smelling faintly of lavender sachets and old dust. I lay perfectly still on top of the floral quilt for 3 solid hours, staring blindly at the dark ceiling, waiting for the ambient noises of the townhouse to completely die down. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, the agonizing dryness in my throat provided the perfect, plausible excuse to venture out. I slipped out of bed, leaving my heavy boots behind, and moved soundlessly in my stocking feet down the curved oak staircase. The ground floor was submerged in heavy shadows, save for a thin, sharp sliver of yellow light bleeding from the crack beneath the heavy double doors of Lorraine's private home office. I froze on the bottom step. The faint, urgent murmur of hushed voices drifted through the narrow gap. I pressed my back against the cool plaster wall of the hallway, holding my breath, and edged closer until my shoulder touched the doorframe. Declan was speaking rapidly, his voice entirely stripped of the smooth, arrogant veneer he had worn during dinner. It was the raw, ragged sound of a man standing on the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. He hissed that they only had a 72-hour window before I inevitably woke up from my morning fog and hired a ruthless corporate shark to lock down the estate. He confessed, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush, that he was drowning. His massive luxury real estate flip in Williamsburg had collapsed spectacularly. The contractors had walked out due to unpaid invoices. The bridge loan was in extreme default, and the private lenders were threatening to completely liquidate his personal assets by the end of the month if he did not produce a massive cash injection. He was facing total, absolute ruin. Lorraine's voice cut through his panic. Remarkably calm and utterly devoid of sympathy, she did not coddle her golden son. Instead, she laid out the execution plan with the chilling precision of a seasoned general. She told him to stop hyperventilating and focus on the paperwork. She explained that she had already drafted a series of temporary asset management agreements under the guise of relieving my administrative burden. If they could just get my signature on those specific pages while I was still heavily sedated by grief, they could legally seize operational control of all 6 Manhattan properties instantly, entirely bypassing the agonizingly slow, restrictive process of formal probate court. The floorboards beneath my feet felt like they were turning to ice, but the true depth of their depravity had not even been fully revealed. Lorraine continued, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made my stomach aggressively churn. She had already contacted a highly motivated, off-market buyer who was willing to purchase the entire portfolio of properties in a single, rapid transaction. Naturally, this shadow buyer was offering a price significantly below market value, but the trade-off was an immediate, untraceable cash closing. Furthermore, she bragged that she had already secured a deeply unethical notary public, an old acquaintance with a suspended license and a flexible moral compass, who was prepared to rubber stamp the transfer documents no matter my mental state. Declan let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded more like a bark. He then delivered the final, crushing blow. He gleefully reminded his mother that the mysterious off-market buyer was not a stranger at all. It was a newly formed, anonymous limited liability company registered entirely under the maiden name of his current fiancée. The sheer audacity of the scheme was breathtaking. They were not just planning to sell my inheritance out from under me at a steep discount to save his miserable skin. They were planning to sell it directly to themselves. They intended to legally launder Evan's wealth through a proxy, strip me of my rightful ownership, and retain total, absolute control of the multi-million-dollar assets from the shadows. I heard the heavy scrape of a leather chair pushing back against the hardwood floor inside the office, followed by the clinking of heavy crystal glasses. They were moving toward the wet bar in the adjoining den to celebrate their brilliant conspiracy. I waited exactly 30 seconds until the heavy footsteps faded into the next room. Then, I pushed the office door open just wide enough to slip my body through. The room was illuminated only by the harsh green glow of the laser printer sitting on the mahogany desk. My heart hammered a violent, erratic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands were remarkably steady. I approached the desk and looked down at the neat, organized stack of freshly printed documents waiting for the morning slaughter. I pulled my secondary, encrypted work phone from the pocket of my sweatpants. Working as a senior records manager for a high-security data preservation firm had taught me exactly how to handle sensitive, explosive materials. I disabled the flash and hovered the camera lens over the pages. The first document was a sweeping, heavily predatory power of attorney granting Lorraine absolute financial dominion. The second was the temporary property management agreement Declan had mentioned. But the third document made my blood run entirely cold. It was a fabricated, highly complex addendum to a prenuptial agreement. Evan and I had never signed a prenuptial agreement. I stared at the page, my eyes quickly scanning the dense legal jargon. Lorraine had somehow procured an old, outdated signature page from a long-forgotten tax filing and attached it to a newly drafted contract that effectively waived my rights to any properties acquired during the marriage. The date at the top of the page had been illegally backdated by 4 full years. I photographed every single page, ensuring the text was perfectly crisp and legible in the digital frames. I captured the forged signatures, the fraudulent dates, and the predatory clauses. I slid the phone back into my pocket, carefully aligned the stack of papers exactly as I had found them, and retreated into the dark hallway. I navigated the stairs in total silence. Returning to the suffocating guest room, I locked the door silently behind me and sat on the edge of the narrow bed. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear for the brother who was actively plotting my ruin, or for the mother who was serving as the chief architect of my destruction. The paralyzing numbness from the cemetery had entirely vanished, replaced by a searing, diamond-hard clarity. I closed my eyes and visualized the sealed envelope sitting safely in my purse. The final message Evan had left me was no longer a cryptic, sentimental warning from a dying husband. It was a meticulously drafted declaration of war. He had known they would come for me the absolute second his heart stopped beating. He had built the fortress, and he had handed me the only key. My family believed they had successfully cornered a fragile, grieving widow. They did not realize they had just handed perfect leverage to a woman who suddenly had absolutely nothing left to lose. The pale, unforgiving light of early morning filtered through the dusty lace curtains of my childhood bedroom, signaling the beginning of my performance. I did not rise immediately. I lay under the heavy, stifling weight of the floral quilt, meticulously crafting the physical manifestation of a broken woman. I rubbed my eyes until the delicate skin around them turned a raw, bruised red, smudging the faint remnants of yesterday's mascara deep into my lash line. I dragged my fingers roughly through my hair, ensuring it hung in limp, defeated tangles around my pale face. When I finally heard the soft, deliberate creak of the floorboards outside my door, I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. Lorraine pushed the door open without knocking, carrying a silver tray adorned with a single porcelain teacup and a piece of dry toast. Her face was a perfect portrait of quiet, enduring maternal strength, masking the predatory anticipation I now knew was boiling just beneath her skin. She set the tray on the nightstand and reached out, her cool, dry fingers brushing a tangled strand of hair away from my cheek. She spoke in a hushed, soothing tone, suggesting that I should remain in bed for the entire day, completely insulated from the harsh realities of the outside world. I leaned into her touch, offering a weak, trembling sigh that seemed to satisfy her completely. I reached for my primary phone, the device that had been buzzing incessantly with condolences, and pushed it weakly across the mattress toward her. I whispered that the constant ringing was making my chest hurt, begging her to hold on to it so I would not be bothered by anyone. Lorraine's eyes flashed with a sudden, triumphant gleam that she quickly suppressed behind a mask of profound sympathy. She slipped the phone into the deep pocket of her cashmere cardigan, promising she would handle all incoming messages and shield me from the overwhelming chaos. She believed she had just successfully severed my only lifeline to the outside world. She had no idea she had simply taken a useless decoy. As soon as her footsteps faded down the staircase, I slid out from under the heavy quilt and retrieved a small, sleek black device from the hidden, zippered lining of my overnight bag. It was my secondary, highly encrypted corporate phone, issued strictly for my executive duties at North Vale Preservation Group. My mother and brother clearly viewed me merely as Evan's passive wife, completely ignorant of the fact that as a senior records management director, my entire professional existence revolved around forensic document tracking, data preservation, and the meticulous verification of corporate paper trails. I spent my days hunting down missing assets, unearthing buried liabilities, and exposing fraudulent compliance reports for massive multinational conglomerates. They had chosen the absolute worst possible target for a clumsy paper crime. I locked the bedroom door, retreated into the small, adjoining bathroom, and turned the shower on full blast to mask the sound of my voice. I quickly established a secure connection and forwarded the high-resolution images I had captured the night before directly to Mara Bell's private, encrypted server. I did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, Mara called me on the secure line. Her usually measured, clinical voice was tight with a potent mixture of professional outrage and sharp, calculating energy. She confirmed my darkest suspicions with brutal efficiency. The documents my family had prepared were not just highly unethical, they constituted multiple counts of severe premeditated felony fraud. Mara, viewing the files on her large office monitors, easily spotted the amateurish discrepancies that my trained eyes had caught in the dark. The margins on the temporary management agreement were completely inconsistent, indicating hastily replaced pages, but it was the prenuptial addendum that truly demonstrated the breathtaking scope of their deceit. Mara identified the boilerplate language immediately. She told me the fraudulent addendum Lorraine had mocked up was actually a butchered, pieced-together Frankenstein monster of a document, lifted almost entirely from an old standard commercial refinancing application Evan had filed nearly 5 years ago. Lorraine had simply swapped the header, altered the primary clauses to strip my ownership rights, and illegally backdated the cover page. Even more damning, the signature they had copy-pasted onto the final page was a digitally lifted, outdated sample. Evan had formally updated his legal signature style 3 years prior, adding his middle initial and a distinct underline for all binding corporate and real estate transactions. The signature on Lorraine's fake addendum was legally obsolete and completely invalid. I stood leaning against the cold bathroom tiles, the hot steam from the shower billowing around me, listening as Mara outlined our counteroffensive. I instinctively wanted to march downstairs, hurl the encrypted phone onto the dining table, and watch their smug, confident faces completely shatter. I wanted to scream until my throat bled, to demand how they could possibly betray my blood and my grief so viciously, but Mara urged absolute, disciplined restraint. She insisted that confronting them now would only cause them to panic, destroy the physical evidence, and retreat into a defensive legal posture. We needed them to feel completely safe, powerful, and utterly convinced of their own success. We needed them to commit the crime fully, to cross the point of no return. While I remained trapped in the Brooklyn townhouse playing the compliant victim, Mara was quietly wiring the entire financial battlefield with invisible, high-voltage explosives. She officially triggered maximum security legal alerts with Evan's primary banking institutions, the private wealth management firm, and the state real estate registry. Any unauthorized attempt to transfer the deeds, access the escrow accounts, or alter the ownership structure of the 6 Manhattan lofts would not only be instantly blocked, but it would also automatically generate a flagged report directly to the Financial Crimes Division. The trap was set. Now, I just needed to provide the bait. I turned off the shower, wrapped myself in a thick, oversized robe, and slowly descended the staircase. I forced my shoulders to slump, dragging my feet slightly across the hardwood floors. I found Lorraine and Declan in the sunlit kitchen, speaking in low, rapid murmurs over steaming mugs of black coffee. They abruptly stopped talking the second I entered, their faces snapping into expressions of gentle, manufactured concern. I began my performance. I wandered aimlessly toward the marble island, staring blankly at the polished surface. I asked Declan, my voice wavering with perfect, manufactured fragility, what day of the week it was, claiming the hours were completely blurring together. I poured a glass of water, intentionally letting my grip slip just enough to spill cold liquid across the counter, and then stood there, helplessly staring at the mess without moving to clean it up. Lorraine rushed over with a cloth, cooing soft, patronizing reassurances while she wiped the marble, exchanging a swift, deeply significant look of victory with Declan over my hunched shoulder. They saw exactly what they desperately wanted to see: a shattered, disoriented widow, completely incapable of managing her own mind, let alone a massive, highly complex real estate empire. They believed I was pliable clay, ready to be molded into whatever shape best served their desperate financial needs. They thought they were expertly pulling the strings, guiding me seamlessly into a trap wrapped in the warm, comforting guise of family care. But as I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly into my cold tea, a profound sense of cold, terrifying power settled deep into my bones. I was no longer just the grieving heir desperately seeking shelter. I had become the meticulous stage director of this unfolding tragedy, and my mother and brother were merely actors, enthusiastically reciting their lines, completely unaware that I had already locked the theater doors and invited the executioners to watch the final act. Escaping the townhouse that morning required a masterclass in submissive acting. I told Lorraine, my voice barely above a hoarse whisper, that I needed to attend a brief, mandatory meeting with the funeral director to finalize the burial invoices. She eagerly offered to go in my place, undoubtedly hoping to further control the narrative, but I weakly insisted it was the last earthly duty I could perform for my husband. She let me go, thoroughly convinced I would return straight to my childhood bed, entirely broken and compliant. Instead, a sleek black town car was idling exactly 3 blocks away. Mara Bell sat in the back seat, her expression completely unreadable as I slid into the leather interior. She handed me a heavy, unadorned brass key. We rode in absolute silence down to Tribeca. The building Mara directed us toward was an unassuming industrial conversion of weathered red brick and oxidized copper. The private elevator opened directly into the sprawling unit. It was completely empty of furniture. The walls were exposed brick, the floors scuffed industrial oak, and the massive, grid-paned windows overlooked the gray, churning waters of the Hudson River. It felt significantly less like a luxury residence and entirely like a fortified bunker. Mara walked straight toward a seemingly solid stretch of smooth drywall near a central structural column. She pressed her palm flat against a hidden panel. It clicked open with a sharp mechanical snap, revealing a heavy steel biometric safe embedded deep into the masonry. Mara stepped back, folding her arms across her tailored suit. She told me Evan had given her strict, uncompromising instructions regarding this specific property. I was only to be brought here, and the safe was only to be opened if I reached a terrifying point where I no longer knew who I could trust. I stepped forward and placed my thumb on the glowing glass scanner. A heavy mechanical thud echoed loudly through the cavernous, empty loft, and the thick steel door swung outward smoothly. Inside the dark cavity sat a neatly stacked row of thick manila folders and a small, silver digital voice recorder. I reached in and pulled out the thickest file. It was heavy, packed tightly with bank statements, aggressive legal correspondence, and financial audits. The name printed neatly on the manila tab was Declan Murray. I dropped to my knees and spread the papers across the dusty oak floor. The true, terrifying scale of my brother's catastrophic failure stared back at me in stark, unforgiving black ink. He was not just struggling with a bad investment, he was completely drowning in a financial abyss. The total debt load he was carrying amounted to over $2.1 million. A heavily highlighted demand letter from a ruthless private equity firm sat near the top of the pile. The firm was demanding immediate total repayment of the bridge loan within a window of less than 10 days, threatening full asset liquidation and criminal fraud charges if he failed to deliver the capital. But the sheer magnitude of his financial ruin was not the most sickening discovery. Attached to the back of the folder were printed transcripts of private emails Declan had sent to Evan over the past 14 months. I read the messages, my chest tightening with a cold, absolute rage. Declan had aggressively badgered my husband about the structural ownership of his real estate portfolio. He asked highly specific, technical questions regarding post-mortem asset transfer rights and corporate succession planning. In one particularly damning exchange, Declan had even sent Evan a link to an obscure legal article detailing obscure loopholes in the digital signature authentication process, casually asking Evan for his professional risk assessment on the matter. This was not a sudden, desperate crime of opportunity born from my brother's sudden financial collapse. Evan had clearly suspected from the very beginning that my own flesh and blood were not just snooping into our lives, but actively laying the groundwork to raid his assets the absolute second a tragedy occurred. I reached blindly for the second folder, my hands moving with rigid robotic precision. It contained copies of postal receipts and scanned envelopes. During the final, agonizing weeks of Evan's life, when I was practically living on a plastic chair in the hospital intensive care unit, Lorraine had generously volunteered to collect our mail and manage the apartment. The documents scattered before me proved she had systematically intercepted and opened certified letters addressed strictly to me from Evan's legal and financial teams. She had deliberately hidden crucial notifications regarding asset restructuring, actively cutting me off from any legitimate source of legal information while I was blinded by impending grief. A sickening, suffocating wave of absolute clarity washed over me, hitting me harder than the freezing wind at the cemetery, the empty graveyard, the phantom schedule change that kept Evan's friends and trusted colleagues away from the burial. The funeral was never just an act of cruelty or emotional neglect. It was a highly calculated, tactical quarantine. Lorraine and Declan had purposefully isolated me, ensuring I was completely walled off from anyone who might offer me a shred of sanity, comfort, or legal counsel before they shoved their fraudulent, backdated papers in my face. They needed me utterly alone, desperate, and mentally broken. My hands were trembling slightly as I picked up the small silver recorder from the steel shelf of the safe. I pressed the play button. The sudden, resonant sound of Evan's voice, deep and calm and remarkably steady, filled the hollow, echoing loft. Hearing him speak again felt like a physical, brutal blow to the ribs, but I forced myself to stand perfectly still and absorb every single syllable. He did not waste time on sentimental goodbyes or tearful declarations. He spoke with the sharp, pragmatic authority of a man dictating a final vital battle strategy to his most trusted lieutenant. He stated clearly, his tone devoid of any hesitation, that if my mother and brother suddenly became overly eager to handle my affairs, if they swooped in to help manage the heavy burden of the estate, it was absolutely not an act of familial love. He warned me that their sudden warmth would simply be the opening maneuver of a hostile takeover. The recording ended with a sharp click, leaving the massive room cloaked in a heavy, ringing silence. I stared down at the scattered papers, the concrete, undeniable evidence of my family's profound, bottomless betrayal. Up until this exact moment, I had been operating entirely on defense. I had been fighting to protect the wealth my husband had left me, reacting to their sinister moves out of a sense of shocked survival. But as I stood up and looked out the massive windows at the jagged, towering Manhattan skyline, the nature of the war fundamentally shifted inside my chest. This was no longer simply a battle over $8.5 million or a portfolio of highly coveted luxury properties. It was an extermination. It was the absolute necessity to permanently sever the invisible, toxic cords that tied me to these people. For my entire life, they had viewed me as a compliant tool, a convenient, soft-hearted lifeline they could exploit and manipulate to salvage their own reckless mistakes. They had assumed my grief would make me weak enough to strip completely bare. They were about to discover that Evan had not just left me a vast fortune. He had handed me exactly what I needed to bring their lies crashing down, and I was finally ready to act. Lorraine called it a memorial brunch. It was Sunday morning, exactly 48 hours after I had watched Evan being lowered into the frozen ground. When I walked down the curved oak staircase, the formal dining room had been entirely transformed. The heavy scent of freshly baked pastries and strong, dark coffee masked the metallic, predatory stench of what was actually unfolding. The antique mahogany table was not set for a quiet family mourning their immense loss. It was staged for a corporate execution. Sitting around the perimeter of the table were three complete strangers. Lorraine introduced the first man, a perpetually sweating individual in a deeply wrinkled gray suit, as Mr. Abernathy, an old community friend who conveniently happened to be a licensed notary public. Next to him sat a slick, overly groomed man introduced vaguely as a private financial advisor. At the far end of the table sat a woman with sharp, angular features, and a cold, assessing stare, representing a supposedly exclusive private investment fund. They were the off-market buyers. They were the scavengers invited to feast on the remains of my life. Declan confidently took the head of the table. He wore a soft, unbuttoned cashmere sweater, expertly projecting the image of a deeply caring, protective older brother. He poured me a cup of chamomile tea and immediately began his practice performance. His voice was smooth, laced with a sickening amount of manufactured empathy. He told me that Evan, bless his soul, had inadvertently left me with a massive, crushing administrative burden. He explained in grave tones that managing 6 luxury properties across the most demanding city in the world was a full-time, exhausting job that would completely destroy my fragile mental health. Declan looked at the woman representing the investment fund and gestured grandly with his open hands. He claimed that this private, sympathetic fund was willing to purchase the entire portfolio in one seamless, quiet transaction. It would completely free me from all terrifying financial responsibility. It would give me the quiet space I desperately needed to heal. He flawlessly framed the systematic stripping of my multi-million-dollar inheritance as an act of profound, brotherly salvation. He used my fabricated emotional weakness as the absolute justification for tearing away my legal decision-making power. I sat hunched over my porcelain teacup, leaning fully into my role. I let my hands tremble violently enough to rattle the delicate cup against the saucer. I kept my eyes wide, deeply unfocused, and swimming with unshed tears. I looked down at the massive, intimidating stack of legal documents placed directly in front of my plate. I told them the dense paragraphs were swimming on the page. I asked, my voice cracking perfectly, what the indemnification clause meant. Then I waited exactly 3 minutes and asked the exact same question again. I picked up the heavy brass pen, purposefully let it slip from my clumsy fingers onto the floor, and apologized profusely while shrinking back into my chair. Lorraine was standing directly behind me. I could feel the rigid, impatient, boiling tension vibrating through her entire body. She stroked my hair, her manicured nails digging just slightly too hard into my scalp, and whispered into my ear that I did not need to understand the complex legal jargon. She cooed that I only needed to trust my family to carry the heavy weight for me. The trap was primed. I reached into my black leather tote bag, resting on the floor beside my chair, slowly pulling it up to rest casually on the edge of the dining table. Tucked discreetly beneath the brass hardware and the thick leather strap was the microscopic, high-definition lens of Mara's hidden camera. It was angled to point directly at the center of the mahogany table. I took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed the heavy stack of property transfer contracts an inch away from me. I looked up at my mother with wide, desperate eyes. I told her I absolutely could not sign these sterile business papers without honoring Evan first. I asked for a sheet of her expensive, thick ivory stationery. I insisted, my voice thick with fake emotion, that I needed to write a personal memorial prayer, a final written promise to my husband, and sign that specific paper before I could bring myself to sign away the homes he had built for our future. Lorraine's jaw tightened visibly. A brief, sharp flash of pure annoyance broke through her sympathetic maternal mask, but she quickly suppressed it to keep the fragile peace. She fetched the stationery and laid it gently in front of me. I placed the blank ivory sheet completely over the legal contracts. I took my time, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably across the room. I wrote a slow, deliberate paragraph about enduring love and eternal legacy. At the very bottom, I signed my name with slow, exaggerated, sweeping loops. Then, I dropped the brass pen, buried my face entirely in my hands, and let out a broken, theatrical sob. I cried out that the pressure was simply too much, that the room was spinning, and that I desperately needed fresh air. I pushed my chair back so violently it nearly tipped over. I stumbled blindly out of the dining room and retreated straight to the downstairs powder room, locking the heavy door behind me. I leaned against the cool porcelain sink, staring at my completely dry, furious eyes in the mirror, and waited. The hidden camera recorded every single frame of what happened the second I left the room. Declan immediately reached out and snatched the signed memorial parchment. The sweaty notary, Mr. Abernathy, pulled a completely different, pre-signed stack of fraudulent documents from his battered leather briefcase. They used the visual alibi of me sitting at the table, holding a pen, and physically signing a document in front of witnesses to justify the notary rapidly stamping his official binding seal on their completely forged contracts. Declan quickly swapped the piles, burying the heavily doctored, illegally notarized transfer agreements deep into his own leather folder. He had absolutely no idea that his desperate, clumsy sleight of hand had just transformed his plot from a murky case of moral manipulation into a documented, irrefutable act of criminal fraud. Later that same afternoon, the townhouse was completely quiet. The predatory guests had departed. I sat curled in the living room armchair, pretending to read a thick novel while staring blindly at the unmoving text. Declan was sitting on the opposite sofa, his sleek laptop open on his knees. I heard the soft, distinct digital chime of an outgoing email. He was sending the freshly scanned, fraudulently notarized documents directly to the shadow buyer. He was aggressively pushing for the immediate wire transfer of the massive cash deposit and demanding they schedule the final, binding closing within 48 hours, absolutely terrified that I might suddenly snap out of my grief and change my mind. He closed his laptop with a sharp, incredibly satisfied snap and looked over at me, offering a gentle, reassuring, and completely hollow smile. Lorraine entered the room, placing a warm hand affectionately on his shoulder. They both truly believed they had just successfully outmaneuvered a lost, entirely disoriented widow. They thought they had brilliantly secured their own financial salvation and stolen my entire future in one swift, ruthless stroke. In reality, they had just painstakingly directed, produced, and starred in the most flawless, high-definition confession video for the devastating criminal trial that was about to permanently destroy their lives. The digital trap Mara and I had meticulously set sprang shut exactly 4 hours after Declan hit send on his sleek silver laptop. The automated security matrix at Evan's primary private wealth management bank flagged the incoming escrow request instantly. Declan had confidently submitted the forged transfer agreements, assuming a standard. Visual signature verification would easily clear the bureaucratic hurdles. He was entirely unaware that just 6 months prior, Evan had completely overhauled his security protocols, mandating a comprehensive biometric authentication profile for all Tier 1 asset transfers. The signature Declan had painstakingly copied and pasted from that outdated tax form completely lacked the embedded digital stylus pressure metrics, the precise stroke velocity, and the microscopic hesitation patterns recorded in my updated encrypted file. The banking system did not simply reject the fraudulent transaction. It completely froze the target accounts and automatically generated an immediate, high-priority fraud alert directly to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I was sitting quietly in the formal parlor, pretending to rest my eyes under a heavy woven throw, when Declan's phone erupted. He began pacing the entire length of the antique Persian rug, his face rapidly draining of color as the representative from the Shadow Investment Fund shouted through the receiver. The buyer was absolutely terrified, demanding to know why the bank's aggressive legal department was suddenly threatening to involve federal regulators over what was supposed to be a quiet, routine property acquisition. Declan stammered uncontrollably, his smooth, arrogant composure shattering into jagged, desperate pieces. When he finally terminated the call, breathing heavily, Lorraine swooped into the room. Her tactical, predatory mind instantly pivoted from celebration to ruthless damage control. She did not express a single ounce of remorse or fear. Instead, she immediately weaponized my supposed grief. She loudly declared to Declan, ensuring her sharp voice carried perfectly to where I lay with closed eyes, that my mental state was rapidly deteriorating. She coldly suggested that I was so deeply unstable and hysterical from the tragedy that I must have simply forgotten giving them my full, enthusiastic authorization to sell the properties. To solidify this newly fabricated narrative and force me into total submission, Lorraine launched a breathtakingly vicious legal strike the very next morning. While I sat silently at the kitchen island staring blankly into a cold cup of black coffee, a stern process server aggressively rang the townhouse bell. Lorraine had actually marched into a New York civil court and filed an ex parte emergency petition for temporary conservatorship. The heavily dramatized, deeply insulting legal filing claimed her newly widowed daughter was suffering a catastrophic psychological breakdown, rendering me completely incapable of making basic rational decisions or managing a highly complex financial portfolio. She was officially asking a judge to legally strip away my basic human autonomy and hand her absolute, uncontested control over my entire life and estate, wrapping her supreme, calculated betrayal in the sickening, palatable disguise of a mother's desperate love. She fully expected me to crumble at the sight of the court papers. She waited for me to weep, to panic, to beg her on my knees to withdraw the petition so I could keep my freedom. Instead, I simply took the thick envelope, retreated slowly to my childhood bedroom, locked the heavy wooden door, and opened my encrypted corporate device. While my family was busy building a fragile house of cards in the public court system, I was actively mining concrete, irrefutable digital data from the shadows. A highly secure email from Mara landed in my inbox, containing raw security access logs pulled directly from the building management system of the premier Soho loft. The digital timestamps attached to the entry codes were completely damning. The records proved beyond any doubt that Declan had bypassed the standard security desk using Evan's emergency master override code to enter the penthouse. He had not gone alone. The accompanying high-definition surveillance video showed him casually guiding two men in tailored suits through the expansive property. I zoomed in on the date stamped in the bottom right corner of the grainy footage. It was exactly 2 days before Evan's funeral. My older brother had been eagerly showcasing my husband's most prized home to prospective buyers, while my husband's body was still resting on a steel table in the county morgue. A secondary video clip, captured by the discreet fisheye camera, positioned in the private elevator vestibule, recorded the end of their illicit, premature tour. The audio feed was crystal clear. One of the investors expressed a mild, lingering concern about the sheer speed of the potential transaction, asking if the grieving widow would truly sign off on such a massive, rapid liquidation so soon after a sudden death. Declan had smirked, an expression of pure, unadulterated arrogance, leaning casually against the brushed steel elevator doors. He then delivered a sentence that would ultimately serve as the final nail in his own coffin. He looked the investor dead in the eye and stated that his mother could get my signature faster than any high-end broker in the entire city. The arsenal of evidence was growing exponentially by the hour, but Mara delivered the final fatal technical blow late that same afternoon. She had successfully managed to intercept the exact digital file Declan had emailed to the buyers, utilizing a trace authorized by our active banking fraud alert. She ran a comprehensive, military-grade forensic extraction on the portable document format file. The embedded metadata stripped away any remaining shadow of a doubt or plausible deniability. The complex hexadecimal timestamps showed the exact minute the document was initially created, the precise software version used to compile it, the author tags matching Declan's personal laptop registry, and most importantly, the digital timestamp of the final modification. The forensic report unequivocally proved that the final pages of the contract were digitally altered and merged nearly 40 minutes after the time I had physically sat at the dining room table to write my handwritten memorial prayer. It was clear, unquestionable proof of the bait-and-switch operation. I sat in the dim light of the guest room, surrounded by glowing screens, methodically compiling a digital dossier thick enough to bury my mother and brother under decades of federal prison time. Downstairs, Lorraine and Declan were moving through the townhouse with a renewed, aggressive swagger, entirely convinced that their brutal court filing had successfully paralyzed me with terror. They expected me to react exactly like the obedient, easily intimidated, desperately eager to please girl I had been my entire life. They were waiting for me to break my silence, to scream accusations they could dismiss as hysteria, to attempt a pathetic negotiation, or to completely surrender my assets for the sake of familial peace. But for the very first time in my 34 years of existence, I absolutely refused to play the role of the dutiful, manageable daughter. I absorbed their staggering cruelty without shedding a single tear or raising my voice. I let my absolute silence stretch through the house, dense, heavy, and suffocating. I allowed them to firmly believe they were brilliantly winning the war, completely oblivious to the fact that my silence was not a symptom of defeat or confusion. It was a perfectly polished, invisible blade, and I was simply waiting for them to walk right into its razor-sharp edge. The total collapse of their escrow pipeline pushed my family from calculated manipulation into sheer, feral panic. Lorraine realized that silent legal threats and fake sympathy were not breaking my resolve fast enough, so she resorted to the absolute lowest tier of intimidation. On a freezing Tuesday morning, heavy fists pounded on the thick mahogany door of the townhouse. Two uniformed officers from the local precinct stood on the front steps, their expressions grim and unyielding. Lorraine rushed past me to open the door, instantly launching into a breathtaking, Oscar-worthy performance of a terrified, desperate mother. She clutched her expensive cashmere shawl, her voice trembling violently, as she informed the officers that her severely traumatized, widowed daughter had completely lost her grip on reality. She formally accused me of stealing a highly valuable collection of heirloom jewelry and several critical, irreplaceable financial documents from her private safe during a manic, grief-induced episode. She practically begged the officers to search my bags and detain me for my own psychological safety. While I was dealing with the police in the foyer, Declan was actively executing a vicious, synchronized strike in the public arena. He had anonymously contacted a notoriously aggressive real estate gossip column that catered to high-net-worth property investors across the entire city. The digital article went live within an hour. It featured a thinly veiled, highly damaging blind item about a newly widowed heiress who was erratically dumping a massive luxury portfolio at rock-bottom prices due to severe psychological instability. The piece claimed I was completely unhinged and desperate for rapid, untraceable cash. Declan's objective was brutally clear. He wanted to entirely destroy my credibility within the elite market, ensuring no legitimate broker or honest buyer would dare to work with me, thereby forcing me back into the corner with his fraudulent, off-market syndicate. They both fundamentally misunderstood who they were trying to destroy. As a senior records management director at North Vale Preservation Group, my entire professional existence was dedicated to the meticulous, unshakable control of physical and digital chain of custody. I did not panic when the police officers awkwardly demanded to inspect my overnight bag. I simply pulled out my encrypted corporate device. I showed the lead officer a series of time-stamped, geotagged, high-resolution photographs of the exact jewelry box Lorraine claimed was missing. I had taken the photos purely as a habit of documenting my surroundings. The metadata proved the box was resting perfectly untouched on her bedroom dresser, merely 15 minutes before the police arrived. During a window of time when I was physically locked inside the guest room, I then exported the raw digital access logs from my phone's internal health application, projecting my exact physical coordinates and step count for the past 48 hours. The unalterable data conclusively proved I had not even crossed the threshold of her master suite in over 3 days. The officers stared at the undeniable digital proof, apologized to me with quiet respect, and walked out, leaving Lorraine standing completely frozen in the hallway, her malicious lie exposed in broad daylight. I packed my bag immediately after the police cruiser drove away and relocated to a highly secure hotel suite Mara had reserved for me in Midtown. That evening, an unexpected ally emerged from the shadows. Lena Torres, the fiercely loyal former chief operating officer of Evans' firm, requested an urgent meeting in the hotel lobby. Lena did not offer useless sympathy. She sat across from me, her dark eyes completely hard, and slid a thick, heavily redacted internal corporate dossier across the table. Lena revealed that Evan had not simply been suspicious of my family, he had been actively running counter-surveillance on them. She opened the folder to display a stack of network security logs. The documents detailed multiple, highly sophisticated attempts to breach Evan's private enterprise servers over the past 8 months. The cybersecurity team had successfully traced the hostile digital footprints directly to a specific residential internet router located in Brooklyn Heights. It was the exact router sitting in my mother's home office. But the most chilling piece of intelligence was what Lena shared next. She explained that Evan had secretly retained a ruthless, independent forensic auditor exactly 6 months prior to his sudden death. He authorized this drastic measure immediately after his executive accounting department received a highly disturbing phone call. The caller, whom the security team later identified through advanced voice-matching software as my brother, had aggressively interrogated a junior financial clerk. Declan had specifically demanded to know the exact legal parameters and loopholes regarding the immediate transfer of massive real estate assets in the event that a surviving spouse was placed under severe duress or a court-ordered medical conservatorship. Evan had known all along that they were actively plotting a hostile legal takeover. The avalanche of vindication continued the very next morning. Mara called my secure line with a massive breakthrough. One of the wealthy private investors Declan had illegally smuggled into the Tribeca loft had abruptly pulled out of the shadow purchase. When the banking alerts fired and the escrow accounts completely locked down, he realized the incredibly lucrative deal was actually a highly radioactive criminal trap. Desperate to shield himself from federal prosecution, the investor decided to flip. He formally contacted Mara's legal team and surrendered a crystal-clear digital audio recording of a private meeting he had held with Declan. On the tape, my brother's arrogant voice echoed clearly, explicitly promising the investor a massive 30% discount on the total market value of all 6 properties if they bypassed the legal waiting periods and wired the cash directly to a proxy account immediately. Mara took our meticulously organized dossier directly to the head of the Financial Crimes Prosecution Unit in Manhattan. The sheer volume of hard evidence was staggering. The digital metadata proving the forged documents, the network intrusion logs, and the audio confessions formed a completely devastating narrative of premeditated felony fraud. The prosecutor was deeply invested. However, she offered a sharp, strategic warning. High-priced defense attorneys could still potentially spin the digital evidence as a complex family misunderstanding exacerbated by immense grief. To guarantee a sweeping federal indictment with absolutely zero chance of a lenient plea deal, the prosecutor needed one final, undeniable act of supreme arrogance. We needed my mother and brother to willingly execute their fraudulent scheme in a closed room, surrounded by credible, independent, and completely uncompromised witnesses. I returned to my quiet hotel room, the silence finally feeling like a heavy weapon I was about to swing. I sat on the edge of the mattress and opened my text messages. I had to invite the predators directly to the slaughterhouse. I typed a message to Lorraine and Declan, purposefully removing all correct punctuation. I channeled the exhausted, entirely broken woman they had spent their entire lives trying to create. I wrote that I was completely drained from the police visit and the constant fighting. I typed that I simply could not handle the immense pressure anymore. I told them they were absolutely right about everything, and I just wanted to sign their final papers so I could disappear and finally find some peace. I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment before pressing send. They would read that text and celebrate their magnificent victory. They truly believed my message was a desperate white flag of absolute surrender. They had absolutely no idea it was the formal, engraved invitation to the total destruction of their lives. The final meeting was staged on Friday afternoon inside the sprawling, glass-walled living room of the Soho penthouse. It was the crown jewel of the 6 Manhattan properties, offering an uninterrupted panoramic view of the jagged city skyline. It was the exact space where my brother had arrogantly conducted his unauthorized tours just days prior. When I stepped out of the private elevator, leaning heavily on Maribel's arm, the atmosphere inside the loft felt less like a solemn legal mediation and entirely like a victory lap for the people waiting to destroy me. Declan was standing by the massive windows, holding a crystal tumbler of sparkling water, surveying the vast city below as if he already held the title deed in his pocket. He was so completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance that he had not even bothered to hide his presumption. Looking down at the street level through the floor-to-ceiling glass, I could easily spot a massive commercial moving truck idling illegally next to the fire hydrant. He had already hired a crew to clear out Evan's antique furniture the second the ink dried. A shiny, freshly cut brass copy of the penthouse key rested blatantly on the marble coffee table. He had arranged everything, operating under the absolute delusion that my total capitulation was an inescapable certainty. Lorraine sat elegantly on the edge of the low-profile Italian leather sofa. She wore a tailored black suit, aggressively playing the role of the deeply exhausted, long-suffering mother who only desired peace of mind for her traumatized child. Yet, her knuckles were entirely white. Her manicured hands maintained a vice-like grip on her heavy designer tote bag, resting tightly against her hip. I knew exactly what she was guarding inside that bag. It contained the thick stack of intercepted certified mail bearing my name and the master rings of spare keys meant for the other 5 luxury lofts. She was hoarding the stolen remnants of my life like trophies. The rest of the cast was assembled around a sleek, modern glass dining table. Mr. Abernathy, the heavily perspiring notary, was arranging his official stamps. The polished financial advisor sat beside him, reviewing a leather-bound folio. Across from them sat the sharp-featured woman representing the Shell Investment Fund, the very entity secretly controlled by Declan's fiancée. On the surface, it appeared to be a remarkably civilized, high-end corporate settlement. I walked slowly toward the glass table, dragging my feet across the polished concrete floor. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting the image of a woman entirely drained of all fight and all spirit. I did not greet them. I simply pulled out a modern steel chair, collapsed into it, and stared blankly at the perfectly aligned stacks of legal documents waiting for my signature. I spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, stating simply that I was completely exhausted, that my chest hurt constantly, and that I just wanted every single piece of this nightmare to be permanently finished today. My quiet declaration caused a profound, collective exhale of relief across the opposition. Declan practically sprinted to the table, his eyes gleaming with undisguised greed. Lorraine offered a soft, deeply condescending sigh of approval. They completely dropped whatever microscopic remnants of caution they still possessed. Declan slid the thickest stack of transfer agreements directly in front of me, uncapping an expensive fountain pen and pressing it gently against my knuckles. He pointed to the yellow sticky tabs indicating where I needed to sign away my entire future. I picked up the pen with trembling fingers. I let the heavy nib hover a fraction of an inch above the pristine white paper. Then, I let my hand fall heavily onto the glass table. I looked up at the representative from the investment fund, my eyes wide and swimming with perfectly manufactured confusion. I told her that my brain was completely clouded by the anti-anxiety medication. I claimed that the dense blocks of legal text were completely blurring together into a meaningless gray mass. I stated that Evan had always insisted I understand what I was signing, and I simply could not read the pages myself. I pushed the entire stack of contracts back across the smooth glass. I demanded, my voice weak and incredibly stubborn, that they read every single vital clause out loud to me. I insisted I needed to hear the exact terms, the final purchase price, and the specific waivers of liability before I could force myself to sign my name. Declan let out a sharp, irritated breath, exchanging a frantic, annoyed look with Lorraine. But they were so incredibly close to the finish line, so completely desperate for the millions of dollars locked inside those pages, that they instantly complied to keep me placated. For the next 45 minutes, I forced my own brother, the fraudulent financial advisor, and the corrupt buyer to sit in a brightly lit room and verbally recite the exact mechanics of their massive felony. I made them read the deeply discounted sale price out loud, proving the catastrophic financial damage they were intentionally inflicting upon the estate. I made them read the aggressive indemnity clauses designed to permanently shield them from future lawsuits. I made them vocalize the immediate, unconditional transfer of all physical access rights. I sat there, a silent, hollow shell, forcing them to meticulously narrate their own premeditated criminal conspiracy, while Mara sat completely still beside me, bearing witness to every single damning syllable. When they finally reached the final page, the room was thick with impatient, suffocating tension. Mr. Abernathy eagerly grabbed his heavy brass notary stamp, holding it suspended in the air, ready to validate the massive theft. Declan pushed the papers back toward me, tapping the signature line with his index finger. I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I slowly turned my head and looked directly at my mother. The trembling fragility entirely vanished from my posture. My spine straightened. The manufactured tears instantly dried, leaving my eyes as cold and hard as the glass table separating us. I asked Lorraine, my voice suddenly ringing with absolute, terrifying clarity, why she was clutching her designer purse so tightly. I asked her, enunciating every single word with lethal precision, why that specific bag contained 3 certified legal letters addressed strictly to me from Evan's attorneys, and why she was carrying a heavy brass keyring that absolutely did not belong to the doors of her Brooklyn townhouse. The air in the penthouse instantly froze. The smug, victorious smile completely vanished from Declan's face, replaced by a mask of sudden, sheer terror. Lorraine's mouth fell open, her face draining of all color as her knuckles turned even whiter around the leather straps of her bag. Mr. Abernathy slowly lowered his notary stamp, his hands beginning to shake violently. They all stared at me, completely paralyzed, finally realizing that the helpless widow they had been eagerly hunting was actually the architect of their doom. Before a single person in the room could draw a breath to answer my question, the heavy metallic chime of the private elevator echoed sharply through the silent loft. The illuminated numbers above the brushed steel doors stopped. The heavy doors slid smoothly open, signaling that the guests Lorraine and Declan had absolutely never invited to their celebration had finally arrived. The heavy brushed steel doors of the private elevator slid apart with a soft, expensive hum that echoed like a thunderclap through the tense silence of the penthouse. The people stepping into the sprawling living room were absolutely not the hired muscle Declan had arranged to empty the apartment. The vanguard stepping onto the polished concrete consisted of a senior fraud investigator from the Primary Wealth Management Bank, a sharp-eyed, unsmiling representative from the Manhattan District Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit, a state notary compliance supervisor carrying a thick leather binder, and 2 massive, heavily armed members of the building's elite private security detail. Mara Bell and I had orchestrated their synchronized arrival down to the absolute, exact second. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single, triumphant tear of righteous anger, nor did I offer a villainous smile. I simply maintained the exact same hollow, exhausted posture as I reached across the glass table. I picked up the sleek silver remote control resting next to the fraudulent contracts and aimed it directly at the massive smart television dominating the far brick wall. The screen flared to life instantly, casting a harsh, bright glare across the horrified faces of my mother and brother. First, I played the high-definition, wide-angle footage captured by the hidden camera tucked inside my leather tote bag during the memorial brunch. The entire room watched in agonizing, undeniable clarity as Declan hastily snatched my handwritten memorial parchment and swapped it for the predatory transfer agreements. The video clearly showed Mr. Abernathy, the sweating man sitting right across from me, eagerly stamping his official brass seal on the forged pages while I was locked inside the downstairs bathroom. Next, the screen flashed the biometric security access logs, clearly proving Declan's unauthorized, clandestine entry into this very penthouse 2 days before the funeral. Then came the dense, highly technical forensic metadata report, detailing the exact minute he had digitally altered the portable document format contracts on his personal laptop. Finally, the audio recording from the defecting investor filled the massive room. Declan's own arrogant, boastful voice echoed off the glass walls, loudly bragging that he could extract my signature through our mother's emotional manipulation faster than any high-end broker in the city. Mara Bell stepped forward, her tailored heels clicking sharply, rhythmically against the floorboards. She reached into her briefcase and produced a single, heavily watermarked legal document. She announced to the frozen room that Evan had executed an ironclad, unbreachable legal directive exactly 6 months before his sudden death. The mandate explicitly stated that any attempted transfer, sale, or encumbrance of the 6 Manhattan properties was instantly and permanently void unless it carried a multi-layered, in-person biometric authentication executed jointly by myself and Mara. The dense stack of papers sitting on the glass table was not just highly illegal, it was legally and fundamentally impossible to execute. The professionals we had invited immediately took control of the room. The senior bank investigator stepped up, confirming in a cold, clinical tone that federal authorities had been actively monitoring the illegal escrow accounts Declan had desperately attempted to open using the forged signatures. Beside him, the state notary supervisor glared down at Mr. Abernathy. She informed the sweating, visibly trembling man that his professional license was officially revoked effective immediately, and he was facing severe mandatory minimum felony charges for authenticating a high-value real estate transfer document without the primary signatory physically present. That was the exact moment Declan finally snapped. The arrogant facade completely shattered. His face flushed a dark, furious crimson, his eyes darting wildly around the room like a cornered animal. He lunged violently from his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor, and sprinted toward the heavy oak exit door near the main foyer. He did not make it 3 steps. The 2 private security guards intercepted him with terrifying speed, pinning his arms sharply behind his back with effortless, brutal efficiency. Seeing her golden son physically restrained, Lorraine abandoned her elegant, suffering maternal posture entirely. She leaped up from the Italian leather sofa, her face contorted into a deeply ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysteria, shrieking that I had deliberately trapped my own flesh and blood. She yelled that I was a vindictive, ungrateful monster who was destroying the family over a misunderstanding. Mara simply tapped the screen of her smartphone, calmly assuring my mother that her spontaneous, vicious, and entirely unrepentant outburst was currently being recorded as a live audio supplement to the official prosecutor's evidentiary file. The representative from the district attorney's office commanded the room's attention, calmly listing the impending criminal charges with the practiced cadence of an executioner reading a death warrant. The list was devastatingly long and incredibly severe: a coordinated conspiracy to commit grand larceny, multiple counts of aggravated corporate document forgery, federal mail theft for hoarding my certified letters, filing false declarations in a civil family court to illegally strip my medical and financial autonomy, and colluding to execute a fraudulent, multi-million-dollar shadow transaction. Then, the prosecutor delivered the absolute final, crushing blow. He gestured casually toward the sharp-featured woman who had been representing the Shell Investment Fund. Declan gasped, struggling against the guards. As the woman calmly packed her leather folio, she was absolutely not his quiet savior. Once her firm had recognized the massive, radioactive federal heat radiating off the desperate deal, she had immediately flipped. Her syndicate had agreed to fully cooperate with the district attorney's investigation to save their own corporate licenses and avoid federal prison. The entire secret, off-market network had completely collapsed directly onto my family's heads. The aftermath of that Friday afternoon was swift, brutal, and totally absolute. Lorraine was permanently stripped of any legal, medical, or financial access to my life, blocked by a highly restrictive, permanent restraining order that barred her from coming within 1,000 feet of me or my properties. Declan was hauled out of the building in heavy steel handcuffs. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility, facing a massive labyrinth of civil lawsuits and a criminal trial that will all but guarantee he spends the next 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I kept the sprawling Soho loft. I took the exact space where they had eagerly gathered to completely destroy my future, and I transformed it completely. I stripped away the harsh, masculine corporate energy and formally founded the Evan Rowe Initiative. It is now a heavily funded, fiercely protective legal and financial sanctuary dedicated entirely to supporting, educating, and defending women who are actively being coerced, threatened, or psychologically manipulated by their own greedy families in high-stakes inheritance and property disputes. Tonight, the penthouse is quiet. I am standing alone before the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, holding a simple porcelain mug of hot chamomile tea. The sprawling, glittering grid of the Manhattan skyline stretches out endlessly before me, millions of golden and white lights burning brightly against the dark. Freezing winter sky. I press my palm flat against the cold, thick glass. Taking a long, deep, completely unobstructed breath, I finally understand the true, profound depth of what my husband did for me. Evan did not just leave me $8.5 million and a highly lucrative portfolio of luxury real estate. By forcing me to face the wolves directly, he handed me the exact tools and the searing clarity required to burn away the toxic, suffocating chains of my past. He gave me the absolute first moment in my entire 34 years of existence where I finally stopped asking my family for permission to live my own life. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.